Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to day 3 and the last day of Project Tiger, Conservation, Conflict and Critique, an online symposium on the past and futures of this controversial conservation program. This is a collaboration between Sheffield Animal Studies Research Center and the Indian Animal Studies Collective. I'm Susan Harris. The first session is titled Histories from Above and Below, and will be from 3:30 to 5. The first set of speakers are Amir Hamza Vangujar, Pranav Menon, and Akshay Chetri, who will present a paper titled Moving Beyond Metaphors of Tiger, Everyday Conservation and One Gujar Subjectivities in the Forests of Uttarakhand and Uttar Pradesh. Amir Hamza Vangujar is the president of the Vangujar Tribal Yuva Sangathan and is also a fellow at Kalpvriksh Environment Action Group, a civil society organization based in Pune. Akshay Chetri is a research associate at Kalpvriksh Environment Action Group, Pune, and a commission member of the International Union for Conservation of Nature World Commission on Protected Areas. And Pranav Menon is a graduate student at the Department of Anthropology, University of Minnesota, who's been engaging as a legal consultant with the One Gujar Tribal Yuva Sangathan since 2020. After that paper, we'll have the second paper for this panel, which is by Mahesh Rangarajan, titled Project Tiger 1966 to 77, or How the Tiger Became Indian and Stayed So. Mahesh Rangarajan teaches history and environmental studies at Ashoka University. His books include Fencing the Forest, India's Wildlife History, Nature and Nation, and most recently at Nature's Edge. And as respondent to both these papers, we have Raza Kasmi, conservationist and wildlife historian with expertise in India's wildlife and forest administration history and conservation policy, who's currently working on a book titled To Whom Does the Forest Belong? The Fate of Green in the Land of Red. The papers will be for 30 minutes each. And before I invite the speakers of the first paper, I'd just like to mention that the videos and the audios of the audience will be muted for the duration of the talk, and the chat function will be disabled. Once they're done with the papers, everything will be re-enabled, and during the Q&A, you'll be able to ask questions or offer your comments on the paper. So I'd like to invite the speakers of the first paper to present their paper, Moving Beyond Metaphors of Tiger, Everyday Conservation and One Gujar Subjectivities in the Forests of Uttarakhand and Uttar Pradesh.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Could you go to the first slide? Yeah, thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. I think the order of the presentation we would do is like Hamza bhai would present for the first 10 minutes, and then Akshay would sort of give like the insights on the tiger relocation policies, and then I would conclude the last segment. So without further ado, I'll like Hamza bhai to begin speaking about this idea.
ठीक गुड इवनिंग एवरीवन। मेरा थोड़ा हिंदी एक्चुअली मेरा लैंग्वेज रहेगा, मुझे इंग्लिश में थोड़ा सा प्रॉब्लम्स है। तो इस पूरे प्रेजेंटेशन की शुरुआत में जो वन गुजर्स कम्युनिटी है उसका जो टाइगर्स के साथ रिलेशंस है, फ्रेंडशिप्स है, उसका जो दैनिक डेली वेज का जो एक फोक म्यूजिक है, उसके साथ दो बैंड है जिसको हम बैंड में गए, उसके साथ शुरू करूंगा। तो सबसे पहले है कि सीते मैसांगो रिश्तानो जंगला बेच बसेरा होवे गुजरते मैस के रिश्ते खासो यावर होवे जंगला बेच मैस ते गुजर गो रोज आनो जानो आयो जावा बिच्चों मैस भी सिंह को खायो। बाघ और बाघ, इसका पहला जो फॉक था उसका मतलब था कि जो क्योंकि हमारी लैंग्वेज में टाइगर को सिंह कहते हैं, तो सिंह और जंगल का जिस तरीके से रिश्ता है, इसी तरीके से सिंह का टाइगर्स का रिलेशन जो है कैटल्स के साथ भी है, गोजरी भैंस के साथ भी है, और वो दोनों कैसे जो है इस जंगल के अंदर रह रहा है। दूसरा जो हमारा बेत है वो है कि बाघ अ,
Oh, Akshay, I think you might need to change the slide.
दूसरा जो है ये हमारा दूसरा बेत है जो बहुत ही अक्सर हमारे जो शिवालिक फुथिल्स है उसमें जो हमारे माई होते हैं वो हमेशा इसको गाते हैं। अ, और ये है शेर शरांदा हो गया बेला शाम जदों हुण होवन वाली देख माइयों किंगा हुण मंजियां चलने वाली। तो जैसे इवनिंग टाइम्स होता है तो हमारे बुजुर्ग लोग कहते हैं कि अपनी भैंसों को देखो कि वो अभी जो टाइगर्स का वर्चस्व का टाइम होता है वो शाम को होता है। तो इसमें बैंत हमारे कम्युनिटीज के बुजुर्ग लोग कहते हैं जो माई माई वो होता है जो कैटल्स की देखरेख करता है हमारे परिवार में, उसको माई कहते हैं। तो माई को संदेश देता है बुजुर्ग की जाओ अपने कैटल्स को देखो, उसकी देखभाल करो कि अभी जो है टाइगर के मूवमेंट का टाइम हो गया है। और ये हमारी वनगुजर्स कम्युनिटीज है जो फुटहिल्स शिवालिक्स और जिम कॉर्बेट और राजाजी टाइगर रिजर्व से लेकर जो शिवालिक्स सहारनपुर का इलाका है, इस तरीके से हमारे लोग जंगल के अंदर रहते हैं। और पूरी तरीके से आप अलग अलग पिक्चर देख रहे होंगे, अगर हम ऊपर के स्लाइड में देखें तो उसमें जो है अल्पाइंस में जब गर्मी सीजन्स में जब लोग हमारे अल्पाइंस में जाते हैं तो ये माइग्रेशन का दृश्य है जो टिहरी के पास में है। और साथ में ही आप देख रहे हो नीचे वाली जो स्लाइड्स है उसमें जो है हमारी गोजरी बहन जो है प्लान माइग्रेशन कर रहे हैं, और बीच में आप डेंस फॉरेस्ट के बीच में अगर आप हट देख रहे हैं तो वो हमारे जो है शिवालिक्स में डेरे हैं। साथ में जो आप देख रहे हो फोडर्स फोडर्स खिला रहे हैं, तो इस फोडर्स के साथ साथ हमारे जो है कैटल्स जो बाकी जो फोडर्स को छोड़ते हैं उसको जो है जो हमारे बर्ड्स होते हैं जिसको हम पीकॉक रेड जंगल फाउल्स ये सब जो है उसको खाते हैं। सेकंड
Next slide.
हम अगर अपने वनगुजर्स कम्युनिटी की हिस्ट्री की बात करें तो हमें जो है जो हमारे वर्किंग प्लान है जो ब्रिटिश टाइम से जो हमारे वर्किंग प्लान थे उसमें हम लोगों को जो है प्रोफेशनल ग्रेजर्स के नाम से पहचाना है, वर्णित किया है, लिखा है। और वैसे हमारी जो पूरी कम्युनिटीज है वो फॉरेस्ट ट्रेवलर्स कम्युनिटीज है। और हम लोगों को जैसे ही जम्मू कश्मीर से जो हमारा हिमालयन बेल्ट है इसके लिए, क्योंकि जितना हमारा ग्रेजिंग पार्ट था उसमें ज्यादातर लोगों द्वारा एग्रीकल्चर का काम ज्यादातर स्टार्ट किया गया, जिसमें लोग हमारी कम्युनिटीज के लोगों ने जो है मोर देन से 4 जनरेशन पहले जो है लोगों ने ज्यादातर खेती का इलाका होने की वजह से, ग्रेजिंग इलाके कम होने की वजह से हम लोग माइग्रेट करना स्टार्ट किया था। और उसके साथ साथ जो हमारा हिमाचल और जम्मू से माइग्रेट करने का जो हमारा इतिहास है वो हमारी दहेज प्रथा के स्वरूप हम लोगों को जो है एक राजा के द्वारा हिमाचल और सिरमौर और जम्मू कश्मीर के राजाओं के बीच में जो विवाह हुआ था उसके माध्यम से हम लोगों को दहेज दहेज के लिए जो है हिमाचल भेजा गया था, जो कि विशेष दूध की आपूर्ति के लिए स्पेसिफिक मिल्क का जो डिमांड थी, जो नीड थी, उसके लिए हम लोग हिमाचल गए थे। उसके बाद हम लोग जो है हम लोग जो है अलग अलग इलाकों में माइग्रेट करके उत्तराखंड के पार्ट्स में आए हैं। और हम लोग रिलीजन्स में सुन्नी है, सुन्नी रिलीजन हम लोग अपनाते हैं, लेकिन हमारा जो धर्म है वो है ज्यादातर जो हमारी सूफी संत प्रवृत्ति है वो पिछले कई सालों से हमारी वही प्रथाएं हैं जो अभी भी हम लोग रखते हैं। और दूसरा उत्तराखंड राज्य में हम लोग ओबीसी में है, और वैसे हमारे जम्मू और हिमाचल में हम लोग जो है ओबीसी में है, जो कि हम लोग इसके लिए स्ट्रगल कर रहे हैं ओबीसी के एसटी शेड्यूल ट्राइब्स के लिए।
और नेक्स्ट स्लाइड
और
अक्षय।
हम लोगों का जो हिस्ट्री वो ज्यादातर हमारा मिहिर भोज के टाइम से, क्योंकि जब कनिष्क मिहिर भोज का राज था तब से हम लोग जो है हमारा राजवंश के साथ अ, हमारा वंशावली है।
वर्किंग प्लान।
तो जिस तरीके से वर्किंग प्लान में हम लोगों का वर्किंग प्लान में हम लोगों को जो है 1883 में अलग नाम से हम लोगों को हमारा जो परमिट्स की प्रथा, उसको पहले हम जो है हकदारी के रूप में हम लोगों को एक डॉक्यूमेंट्स के रूप में प्रदर्शित किया गया है। बीच में हम लोगों को जो है अलग अलग नाम से जो भी हमारे वर्किंग प्लान ऑफिसर्स हैं उनके द्वारा जो हम लोगों को पहले जो है सबसे पहले जो ग्रेजिंग परमिट से पहले हम लोगों को जो राहदारी टैक्स दिया जाता था, उसके बाद हम लोगों को परमिट प्रथा में लाया गया, जो कि हमारे इलाके में जहां हम लोग ग्रेजिंग करते वहां हम लोगों को डिपार्टमेंट द्वारा परमिट दिया गया था। और जो वन शब्द जो लगा है वो हमारा एक रिलेक्स संस्था थी जिन्होंने वन गुजर्स कम्युनिटी के लिए काम किया था। रूरल लिटिगेशन टाइटलमेंट का नाम था 1980 के दौरान। वहां से उन्होंने हमें वन गुजर का नाम दिया गया था। और क्रिमिनल ट्राइब्स हम लोगों को पहले माना गया था, क्योंकि ब्रिटिश टाइम्स में हम लोगों को क्रिमिनल ट्राइब घोषित किया हुआ था। जन्मजात से हम लोग क्रिमिनल टाइप थे 1871 में। और हम लोगों को भैंस चोरी के नाम से हम लोगों को जाना जाता था। और और उसके बाद हम लोग जो है स्वतंत्र भारत में 1951 के दशक में हम लोगों को क्रिमिनल ट्राइब से हटाया गया।
Actually, I think next slide.
और ये है हमारा जो मेरा मेन मकसद है आप लोगों के सामने पेश करना, वो है कि वन गुजर्स कम्युनिटीज और टाइगर के साथ किस तरीके से रिलेशनशिप है, और पूरे टाइगर प्रोजेक्ट को जिस तरीके से पूरी पूरी दुनिया देखती है उस तरीके से वन गुजर्स किस तरीके से टाइगर प्रोजेक्ट को देख रहा है। एक्चुअली जितनी भी साइंटिफिक और टेक्निकल तरीके से टाइगर्स प्रोजेक्ट बनाए जाते हैं, टाइगर प्रोटेक्शन एरिया बनाया जाता है, उसको वन गुजर्स कम्युनिटीज जो है अपने तौर तरीके से आइडेंटिफाई करती है। किस तरीके से राजाजी टाइगर रिजर्व और जिम कॉर्बेट टाइगर रिजर्व दोनों के बीच में जो लेस नोन पार्ट है, इसको जो है ट्रैकिंग एरिया और जो है मूवमेंट ट्रांजिस्ट एरिया माना जाता है। लेकिन वन गुजर्स उस टाइगर्स को, जैसे हम शिवालिक के कोटद्वार डिवीजन में हमारे लोग हैं, तो वो जैसे हमारे शिवालिक वृत्त में कम्युनिटी मूव करती है, इसी तरीके से टाइगर भी मूव करता है। और इस पूरे टाइगर्स हैबिटेट्स एरिया में अलग अलग वन गुजर्स जो है नाम देता है। अगर हमारा कोगड़ का फॉरेस्ट एरिया है तो उसमें जो है हमारा हम लोग हमारी कम्युनिटी मानती है कि इस इलाके में सबसे ज्यादा जो है टाइगर हंटिंग करता है। तो यह हमारे यहाँ संदेश होता है कि हम लोग जो टाइगर्स को हम वीकली पार्ट के रूप में देखते हैं, और बृहस्पतिवार को मेन जो है उसका मूवमेंट एरिया बृहस्पतिवार को सिलेक्ट करते हैं। तो हमारा सबसे ज्यादा जो बुजुर्गों से जो कहना आया है कि जो बृहस्पतिवार टू बृहस्पतिवार यानी 1 वीक के अंदर एक राउंड टाइगर्स का होता है जो वो हंट करता है। तो उस राउंड में हम लोगों को अपने कैटल्स को दूसरी साइड में ले जाना होता है। तो ये हमारी दिनचर्या डेलीज वीज की जो लाइफ है उसमें इम्पोर्टेंट फॉर द टाइगर्स मूवमेंट एंड टाइगर हंटिंग्स द लाइफ स्टॉक्स। इस तरीके से हम लोगों का पूरा एक वर्किंग प्लान है जो जो कभी लिखा नहीं जाता है, लेकिन वो कम्युनिटीज के दिनचर्या में प्रचारित होता है, प्रसारित होता है। और उस तरीके से इसका एक बहुत अच्छा सा एग्जाम्पल है, जैसे कि राजाजी टाइगर रिजर्व में लोगों को रिलोकेशन करके चिड़ियापुर रेंज में बसाया। लेकिन अगर आप आज की दृष्टि में देखें तो सबसे ज्यादा जो है टाइगर मूव करके जो है चिड़ियापुर के आसपास झिलमिल झील और श्यामपुर रेंज में पाया जाता है, क्योंकि वन गुजर कम्युनिटी को राजाजी से रिलोक किया गया है। तो ये एक पूरा हमारा परिवेश है, और हमारे परिवेश के द्वारा जो है वन गुजर समुदाय द्वारा जो है अपने तरीके से टाइगर्स को पहचाना जाता है, टाइगर की लाइफस्टाइल को पहचाना जाता है। लेकिन इसमें सबसे बड़ी विडंबना है कि जिस तरीके से आज पूरे दुनिया हमारे इंडिया जो है 50 साल पूर्ण होने पर जो है टाइगर रिजर्व को मना रहे हैं, लेकिन जिस टाइगर को जिस समुदाय द्वारा अपने जीवन शैली के अंतर्गत एक अपने स्वरूप से और अपनी आइडेंटिटी से उसको एक परिवार माना गया है, लेकिन उस कम्युनिटी को कभी भी जो आज 50 साल के बाद एक नया प्लेटफॉर्म नहीं दिया गया है। ये मेरी सबसे बड़ी विडंबना है। और मैं ज्यादा न बोलकर अपनी वाणी को यहीं विराम करता हूँ। सभी का थैंक्स, धन्यवाद।
Thank you, Hamza bhai. I think moving on from what Hamza was also talking about, how one could just perceive the landscape. Now we're trying to understand how tiger conservation as a policy has affected the relationship between the Van Gujars and the landscape. So due to the nature of their mobility, like Hamza bhai shared, that there is a considerable overlap in the spaces that are occupied by the Van Gujar community and the notified tiger reserves or the designated tiger corridors. It could be core areas, buffer areas, identified corridors. So there is a considerable overlap. And due to this overlap, there has been kind of an institutional imposition on the spaces that are occupied by the Van Gujars. Now, what are the kind of institutional impositions that we are talking about, and what is the impact of these impositions. So here we can see on different aspects in terms of criminalization. There is heavy criminalization of the community, which we can understand in two ways. So the first one is through various sections under the Indian Forest Act, under the Protection Act, and the definition of what a critical tiger habitat is. There is restrictions or a ban on activities, which are very central to the Van Gujars, such as activities such as grazing or lopping, access to firewood, fodder, etc. The second form of criminalization is, since they are forest dwellers, since they share that space with the tigers, as Hamzabai was saying, there is when there are instances of poaching or hunting, the first accusation is put on the Van Gujars, since they are forest dwelling communities and they reside in close spaces with the wildlife. The second restriction or imposition we can talk about is dispossession. Dispossession happens to various ways. One could be through relocation. In terms of the consent, the consultations that are held with the community, the consent taken from these communities, in terms of the settlement of rights processes. We can also talk about the latter stages in the post-relocation status, where the packages that are supposed to be given under the relocation guidelines, these are not provided. One of the major issue has been that in cases where there has been rehabilitation of the Van Gujars, the land is still it's still notified as a reserve forest. It's still under the control of the forest department. So that's when we talk about relocation, that it's a win-win for communities and wildlife. The rights that were not given in the forest, they are not able to access those rights and welfare schemes as of now also. The second form of dispossession we talk about is evictions, where in the first instance we see that there is at least a relocation package that is given to a certain extent or not given. Here we see that since they are seen as encroachers, they are not seen as original inhabitants of the land. They are evicted without any consultation, without any facilities provided to them wherever after they are evicted. Other instances we see is that of militarization and surveillance. We know that the tiger conservation policy, the regime is getting stricter and stricter as the number of increase in tiger populations. Due to these, there are the criminal cases filed on these Van Gujar communities has been increasing rapidly. The second aspect is also the fact that the increase of surveillance technologies such as camera traps, drones in these conservation areas, especially in tiger reserves, is also increasing, and this infringes directly on the pastoralism aspect of the Van Gujars. Tourism is also another very important and debatable topic when we talk about tiger conservations. We've seen cases such as in Rajaji, close to where Hamza also stay, where there are, in order to create tourism zones, in order to create spaces for tourism, there is dispossession of communities, or there is efforts to evict them from those areas. Just give me a minute, I'm not able to change my slide. Yeah. So this is just a basic timeline about what we were talking about. The overlaps in terms of the uh, beginning of Project Tiger, the gradual expansion of tiger reserves or tiger areas in the spaces occupied by the community, and the direct implications in terms of the displacement that have been happening over the years. So we see that in 1973, Project Tiger began, where Corbett was included. In 1983, Rajaji was identified as a national park. Just after Rajaji was notified as a national park, there were processes to evict those areas. But due to a Supreme Court stay, the Forest Department was notified to ensure that a relocation package was provided to them. So this continued over the decades. In 1992, Sona Nadi was included as part of the Corbett Tiger Reserve. In 2010, after Corbett Tiger Reserve was notified under the Wildlife Protection Act. In 2013, we see that families were relocated from the Sona Nadi Wildlife Sanctuary, which is also part of the core area of the Tiger Reserve. Even after 2016-17 onwards, we've seen that some of the families, especially in Rajaji and in the buffer areas of the Corbett Tiger Reserve, the Van Gujars families have been getting constant threats from the Forest Department to evict them from those areas and to remove them from those areas. Now we talk about what relocation package is, what is the socio-political, socio-economic policy of relocation, and how it's impacted the cultural ethos of the One Gujar community. So this is just a basic kind of a summary of what the relocation package is about. So there are two options. One is the first option of giving the entire monetary package to the families that are proposed for relocation. The amount was increased to 15 lakhs in 2021. Second option is that of a rehabilitation package, where we can see the breakdown in terms of the agricultural land that is provided, settlements of rights, the home housing facilities provided, and other commune facilities provided to the community. This is just a summary of what the relocation has been in terms of in the two tiger reserves where the One Gujar stay. And here we see that if we compare it with the relocation package, we see that the entire entire package that was supposed to be provided to the families that has not been provided even after 20 to 30 years of their relocation. We also see in the later points, you can see that there are more than half of the families that were residing earlier within these areas have not been actually given the packages. So that is the eviction that we are talking about. There is most of the families are residing in the Dehradun and Haridwar Forest Division without any housing facilities, without any facilities provided. And there is a case too that is going on in the Nainital High Court, where the High Court had ordered the Forest Department to provide the relocation packages to these families. But that too has not even happened over the last 2-3 years as well. Now comes to the main point about the direct impact of the socio-economic policy of relocation on the cultures of the One Gujars. So what is the first impact that we see? The first impact that we see is that there is a major shift from their livelihood source, from that of pastoralism to agriculture. The relocation package itself provides agricultural land to these families. So in the relocation package, there's no areas for grazing that is provided, no fodder, no facilities for fodder that is provided. Therefore, we see that a shift is seen from pastoralism to agriculture. As they are sedentarized, as they are relocated, their migration routes are stopped. They are not able to migrate to their alpine areas, as Hamza Bhai was saying. The second major impact that we see on the culture of the community is the restriction on entry to forest. So while we were talking about institutional imposition due to tiger conservation, the language there was a bit different in terms of the restrictions or the bans that have been imposed on the community. Here we see a complete disassociation from the forest, because since agricultural land is provided, since all the facilities that is provided for you in the rehabilitation site is for the reason that the communities do not access those forests. Therefore, even instances such as facilities that the community have been using in their day-to-day life, in terms of grazing, in terms of lopping or firewood and fodder for the cattle, that has also completely stopped. The third aspect we see is the change in livelihood source. As they are a migrating community and their focus was made on pastoralism and subsistence from the Gojri buffaloes. Milk, ghee, and other milk producers were their main forms of subsistence. Now we see that there has been a shift from this daily subsistence mechanism to a more seasonal one that depends on the seasons for agriculture, the different kind of produces you can grow. The second change we see in terms of the livelihood source is that many families in the rehabilitated sites have also been have also started to rear sheep and goats at a larger number. This is for the simple reason that they need to sell these meats for an additional source of income. Other dependence on also the fact that since these are not predominantly communities who practice agriculture, so it has been a difficult transition for them. So many have also moved away from agriculture to other forms of subsistence, such as daily wage labor in nearby factories or construction sites, or they move to distant areas for earning their daily wage. Now, in the One Gujar community, the role of women is also that of a significant one, and that too has seen a change due to the relocation policy that we've been talking about. The first one is, since while migrating, and since milk and ghee and other milk producers are the central part of their daily subsistence, and the production of these milk products are done by the women. Now we see that due to relocation, their access to forest produce, the decrease in number of buffaloes in the family, their role in the family too has decreased, and thereby impacting their agency within the family itself. The major Another major change we see is the impact on the worldviews of the community. So Penche is a traditional governance systems of the community, where the discussions on Penche are more related to their access to forest. Now, since the after relocation, their access to forest has decreased. Their the direct impact has been on the decision making systems and these governance systems within the community. Due to relocation and mainstreaming of such of the community itself, there are other factors which have also come into play in terms of the decision making system within the community due to socio-economic and other political influence that has directly impacted the community. There are also aspirational changes. While the forest provided a daily subsistence for them, therefore there was not major dependence on monetary on money or finance. Now, due to this change, there is increasing financial insecurity within the family, and therefore, uh, the, due to this financial insecurity, they've been having to explore different ways of securing their livelihoods. Saying this, I'd like to just maybe Pranav can continue. Thank you.
Uh, so, so, so somewhere it's important for us to understand how the perspectives around Tiger and what the policy orients and what it is has multiple contested meanings. And in that way, how communities interact or how different communities interact with the tiger, there is a certain kind of notion of complementariness as well as contradictoriness. But for One Gujars has some of the poetics which Hamza explained through the Beth, there is a kind of kin making practice which you can see not necessarily just with the tiger but with other wildlife as well. And there's a kind of embodied relationality which relationality they possess with the livestock and how that relationality which they have with the livestock then transposes on to other animals around which they live. So, Nanika Mathur has mentioned about this notion of Kagzi Bagh, and somewhere the Project Tiger or how Tiger Reserves as a policy operates, it exists more in the paper where the forest department is constantly keen to tame the real tiger using bureaucratic processes. But uh, this can be one example, whereas in one another example of how the state tries to navigate to portray the tiger can also go to other metaphors. So, in the Shivalik region where Hamza was explaining, Shivalik range in Saharanpur region, uh, there is an increased form of militarization where diversion of forest land, which was otherwise supposed to be a part of that extended corridor between Rajaji Park, Kalesar National Park in Haryana, and was somehow diverted to the army. So here, then the army is the presence of a Jawan or them engaging in target practice becomes a metaphor of how the tiger replaces what conservation could mean. So yes, on one hand, we assume the tiger to be the animal and having that kind of autonomous agency, but for the one Gujar, then the tiger in this form can also be like the empowered Jawan. Similarly, as we are aware from Radhika Govindrajan's work as well as certain other scholars working in Uttarakhand, there is a notion of how conservation is also very much tied with religious sentiment. So and how the Islamic faith per se is seen as anti-conservation. Uh, some of these narratives particularly come to the fore in Rajaji, where you do understand that when Hindu festivals were practiced, such as like the Kawad Mela, there is that assumption that religious exceptionalism can be normalized for certain events. But if the one Gujars practice in everyday pastoral labor, that kind of work is not normalized. So, for instance, there are many. There was the I had happened to visit tiger reserves at night, and they said no, Bhole Baba will save us because our faith is more stronger. So somewhere then the tiger is also like symbolic of a particular narrative of conservation, which one can see in Uttarakhand. So this is one more metaphor which is attached to how tiger is seen. But they speak the tiger. They find the wild.
Pranav, we can't really hear you. Did they get disconnected?
Yes, he's dropped off. I'll just let him.
Akshay, hi. I wonder if you could, if you know how,
Hi,
if you could start concluding.
are we back?
We're currently we're 1 or 2
Hello?
minutes towards the end.
Yeah. Pranav
Hello?
is here. I think he can.
Hi, Pranav. Akshay, could you step in and maybe tell us about the conclusion of the paper?
Sure.
Thanks.
So I think Pranav was also talking about the fact that tiger conservation in this current landscape is also seen as as a space for wildlife organizations um, to just give me a minute. Sorry. So tiger conservation as a space for wildlife organizations who've been imposing on on the space of such communities as well. And now that we also saw that how the tiger 50 years of Project Tiger was also celebrated as a symbol of development and as a symbol of a success, which without taking into account the historical injustices that have happened over the past 50 years, is also, I think, a major aspect of how tiger has been observed or has been seen in the larger framework of tiger conservation in India. Saying this, I think, I mean, Pranav would have been the better person to conclude, but I think we can, since due to internet connectivities, we can maybe stop here.
Thanks so much for that wide-ranging paper, Amir, Akshay, and Pranav. Especially since we've been talking about the One Gujars around them since day one. Now I invite Mahesh Rangarajan to present his paper, and we'll have the response by Rasa Kasmi right after that, along with the Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. I'm struck by the fact that this very distinguished audience, I'm probably the only practicing historian. It's always a problem because in history we are dealing with events of the past, and we don't have the advantage of the immediate, and we have to be a little careful because one of the things we know about the past is that it's possible to know it better and better over time. Not only is there more kinds of information, there are also new ways of perceiving the past. So I'm struck by the fact that the Project Tiger and the forest home of the tiger, I'm using the term forest in a broad sense, have cast a deep shadow. There's a shadow because preservation, which is what Project Tiger was about, could be deeply enabling. It was claimed, and I don't think the claim is entirely without validity, which I'll come to in a moment, that it enabled a reversal of the process of endangerment, possible extinction of the tiger as a species. More than that, of the range of other species that shared its home and of those habitats. But that the particular approach that was often adopted, not always, but often, could be limiting and limited. And the same process of enablement could also cast a shadow over the diversity of livelihood practices or ways and forms of living by different peoples within and outside these areas. There's a similar point, of course, that Project Tiger itself arose. There was reference at the beginning to the launch of Project Tiger, 1st April 1973. It was in Corbett National Park, which is the oldest national park in Asia. When it was gazetted in 1936-37, it was called the Haley National Park, after a very important governor of the United Provinces. And it was carved out of shooting blocks in an old reserved forest. The reserved forests had been taken over under the Forest Act of 1878. Reserved forests were places where rights were recorded and settled. So there was a process of enclosure of the forest, which then saw not only extraction of timber and working plants, but also limitations on sport hunting. So the shooting block is a place where licenses were given. And in 1936-37, those licenses stopped being given. When India became independent in 1947, this park was renamed. The process of the end of colonialism often involves also a process of trying to revisit history. And this park was renamed the Ramganga National Park after the river Ramganga. 2 years later, it was renamed, most unusually, after an Englishman who, by the way, left India in 1947 because he and his sister Maggie were descendants of one of the soldiers who had fought in 1857-58. They, for reasons which we would find baffling, feared for their lives and went off to Kenya, where Cobbett died. It was renamed after Cobbett because Cobbett was seen in Kumaon and Garhwal as someone who was a protector of people from man-eaters and cattle drifters. It is very, very significant that this project, therefore, is launched in a place which is redolent of history. The situation today is, of course, and many people have referred to this question of celebration, the tiger is on the rebound in South Asia, particularly in India, also Nepal, Bhutan, and Bangladesh. But if you look at the larger picture of the tiger, and I'm still staying within the terms of a project, because to me as a student of history, it's important we look at when there are actors, the way they cast their terms, we need to ask why they cast it, but we can even examine them critically in terms of their own casting. While the overall picture is of tiger on the rebound, in terms of numbers, number of reserves under protection. Actually, the broad areas where tigers are found would be divided into three in India. There are areas of one we call tiger eclipse or extinction. Raza Kasmi has movingly written about many areas of East Central India, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, many parts of Odisha, where the tiger is effectively extinct functionally as a species, even within reserves. Then there are areas of tiger persistence. There are many areas where tigers continue to exist, and there are areas of tiger vibrance. It's significant to make this distinction because we are dealing with a very large area. Tigers are supposed to be there now in some 400,000 square kilometers, and it's difficult to generalize about them. This, of course, is very crude. Why does one think of this notion of how the tiger became Indian? One answer is rather simple. In 1972, it was a year of major political changes in this subcontinent, 71-72. December 1971 was the War of the Liberation of Bangladesh. And in 1972, the tiger achieved a very important feat, or rather, the tiger was designated as national animal in not one but two nation states. In the newly independent state of Bangladesh as a symbol of Bangla nationalism. And in India, its designation was justified by the then chair of the Indian Board for Wildlife, that the tiger was a symbol of unity and diversity. It was found, he said, in 11 of 16 states, whereas the lion, which had been the national animal, was found in only one. The lion at this time was designated as the state animal of Gujarat. It's significant that if you were to go 10 years before this, 1961, just around 10 years, Queen Elizabeth II visited India with her consort Prince Philip. They visited Savai Madhopur forests as guests of the Maharaja Jaipur, and they shot at a tiger, Prince Philip did. At this time, this was defended by the naturalist E.P. saying that shooting a tiger in India is like shooting a stag in Scotland. And I think it's important to keep in mind that the backdrop to Project Tiger, the previous 5, 6, 8 years, saw an intense debate in which there were two important influential communities of interest and opinion. The community of commercial forestry in India in the years after independence drew a lot from imperial forestry, but the forest was seen as a source of raw materials for manufacturing and for industry. And this process begins to be reversed, this idea of seeing the forest in India in precisely this period, the late 60s, the 70s, leading up to 90. The other, of course, is sport hunting was seen in independent India as a source of foreign exchange. In 1969, when the International Union for Conservation of Nature met in Delhi, leading cabinet minister, V.C. Shukla, who owned an important shikar company, Alvin Cooper, remarked that India could not afford to protect the tiger because each tiger would fetch at least 40,000 rupees of foreign exchange. So it's very significant in the late 60s. There are intimations of change. There are 3 mammal surveys which are done, 3 animal surveys of the gavial, the wild buffalo, and the tiger by the Bombay Natural History Society, which goes back to the 1880s, which by this time is staffed by Indians. And these figures, interestingly, on tiger numbers, are based on interviews with foresters. They're not really surveys of the habitat. These are corroborated by a forester from Rajasthan, and I want to emphasize this, Kailash Sankala, whose own credentials are interesting because he was from the princely state of Jodhpur. He was the son of a forester. And given the salience of caste, class exclusions in India, he's one of the very few figures in North Indian conservation who's not from the what are known today as the forward classes. He was from what are today classified as the other backward classes. He was a botanist by training. He was deeply abhorrent of shikar. He'd spent his entire life in the wildlife field. And he got a Nehru Fellowship. And he wrote a fellowship report on the status of the tiger in India. And he showed that in many places where licensing permits had been given, they couldn't even find tigers to shoot. Either they were too few or they were too shy to be shot. So the 1969 address of Mrs. Indira Gandhi to the IUCN is often pointed out as a landmark, and rightly so. Jairam Ramesh in his book says so, where she argued that we do need foreign exchange, but not at the cost of some of the most beautiful, furred, feathered, and 4-footed inhabitants of our land, unquote. See, by one stroke, she's transforming these animals into fellow citizens. There's a redefinition of the notion of heritage as not only consisting of monuments, styles of dress, languages, or cultures, but also of natural treasures, such as the animals, the birds, the mountains, the rivers, the plants. This, of course, cannot and should not be seen in isolation. The same month when she spoke, November 1969, was a time of seismic shifts in Indian politics. The ruling Congress party, whose majority had been heavily dented in the elections held under her leadership in 1967, split. And in this split, she moved a little to the left. The emphasis was that the Congress would address many of the issues of agrarian distress, of malnutrition, of inequality. And it was on this left-wing platform that she would fight and win the next elections. Significantly, one of the planks which she fought on was the abolition of privy purses, the privileges of the princes. And it's no coincidence that many of the shikar companies were owned or patronized by former princes. So there's a very interesting parallel then of the promise that there would be land reform, the crackdown in the late 60s and early 70s on smugglers, hoarders, black marketeers. And at this time, Government of India, 1970, also moved to ban the export of leopard and tiger skins. So I would emphasize there is a larger political context to this, where the idea of nature and natural heritage is being used to frame a different kind of idea of the nation, somewhat distinct from what had existed in the first 20-odd years after independence. Attendant upon this was the fact that India had been through a very serious crisis in the late 60s, importing over 19-20 million tons of grain from the US without the foreign exchange to pay for it. And by 1969-70, India became a country very critical of the American handling of the war in Vietnam. I know this may not look very relevant to a history of the tiger, but the late 60s is a time of a great upwelling of movements across the world. Gender, race, uh, the independence of small nations. It's the time of the invasion of Czechoslovakia, the intervention of the US in Vietnam and Cambodia. And it's interesting that the Lusaka non-aligned summit also talked not only about the threat of nuclear annihilation, but about chemical defoliation in the war in Indochina. So the 1972 Project Tiger, 72-73, comes about in a very interesting stage where Indo-US relations are in the freeze because of the US tilt towards Pakistan under Richard Nixon. But the largely European-led World Wildlife Fund and the International Union for Conservation of Nature, which were both headquartered in Switzerland. There's very interesting work, a book called Nature's Diplomats. They decide on launching an international project called Operation Tiger, raising $1 billion, and India agrees to sign up. I want to emphasize that for a country like India, engagement with European royalties such as Prince Philip or Prince Bernard of the Netherlands actually provided a certain amount of diplomatic elbow. This relationship was significant in the sense that experts from abroad were not, I want to emphasize, not allowed into India to do research. Unlike in Nepal, which opened the doors to the Smithsonian and launched the Chitwan Tiger Ecology Project. The Project Tiger was seen as a project to save the Indian tiger, staffed and run by Indians. So this is a period of a very specific kind of nationalism in the aftermath of 1972. It's significant that the task force report was written largely by not only Sankla, but by M.K. Ranjit Singh, who, unlike Sankla, was from a princely family. He had the somewhat dubious distinction, which he writes about in his autobiography, of having shot over 50 tigers. In talks about his book, he has referred to himself half jocularly, quoting a very famous Hindi proverb about a cat who ate a lot of mice and went off on a pilgrimage. But I think there is a historical parallel. There are many, but I want to cite one, that the bison around 1900, 1901 became American. See, before that, it was just a bison. And Teddy Roosevelt and others, as Eisenberg has shown, declared it the American bison. And the bison became American because it was seen as a symbol of the frontier. It had to be saved. Bisons were bred. Many, by the way, were brought in from Canada and released. And it's no coincidence that the saving of the bison in these parks was seen as a means of reviving the frontier spirit, and that the Indian Wars had ended just 10 years before that. So the Indians were in reservations and the bisons were in parks. So it's very much a white man's world, sort of, saving of the bison in order to secure the frontier spirit, which would keep America vibrant and alive. You see this in a very different way in 1926. Kruger Park, new book just out by Sandra Swart on the Lions historian, will reinforce the ways in which white supremacy played out in South Africa. My sense in the Indian case is that it is a double-edged sword. Double-edged because it is very significant that by the mid-70s, 75, 76, these 9 tiger reserves are designated. Commercial forestry stops. Sport hunting, of course, stops. It's not really practical at that time, or possible indeed, given the nature of the constitution in India with division of powers of the union and the states, for the federal parliament to even enact legislation. To do this in 1972, under Mrs. Gandhi's leadership, when they dissolved the state assemblies after the war in Bangladesh, there are state elections. The Congress party wins most, or not all of them. These state assemblies pass a resolution, and it's because of these that the Wildlife Protection Act, which was referred to by the previous speaker, was passed in 1970. So it's interesting that between 69 and 89, the area of protected areas, wildlife sanctuaries, parks, goes up tenfold. India begins with 9 tiger reserves. Now there are 53. And by the mid-70s, the claim is that the numbers of tigers have risen. Significant, 1972 was the first time that there was an all-India census of vertebrates in India, 4-legged vertebrates. As you know, the first decennial census of the most important vertebrate that exists on planet Earth, of the number of people in the British Indian Empire, was conducted 1871, 1881. But in 1972, India tried to count its tigers. They used a pugmark method developed by a forester, Saroj Raj Chaudhary from Orissa. Today, it's a very discredited method. but I think it played a very important role because it gave a number, 1,827. Please note how exact the number was. And there was a figure quoted by E.P. Gee, 40,000 turn of the century, no scientific basis, but these capture the imagination. So I think there's a larger sort of mobilization of opinion, and it's not merely elite opinion. There's very interesting work on the creation of tiger reserves in the state of Karnataka by someone who, of course, is very much a partisan, Dr. Ulas Karan, where he shows that the forest minister who presided over the creation of Bandipur was from coastal Karnataka, where there was virtually no forest. And I want to emphasize that the legitimation of Project Tiger, the wildlife conservation programs, and of the Forest Conservation Act 1980, which seemed to put a halt on the officially sanctioned rate of conversion of forest to non-forest cover over the next 20 years, roughly 1980 to 2000, was seen as critical for the agrarian economy. So the tiger becomes a symbol of the monsoon forest. The forest becomes a guarantor of the agrarian order because it stabilizes the hydraulic cycle. And this has its reflections in popular culture in manner which is rarely appreciated by many of us. I am trying to revisit this now. And I'm struck by the fact that a month after Project Tiger, a very important Hindi film is released called Zanjeer. And it's about an angry young man, a police officer. And interestingly, his companion who helps him is a man called Sher Khan. Those of you who know Mowgli would know that there's an inversion of the Mowgli epic where Sher Khan is the bad tiger who tries to eat up Mowgli. More important, in one scene, this character, Sher Khan, refuses to take money for a hit on this police officer. And he adds that this officer is a sher. He says, Vijay, the officer concerned, is a tiger. Sher Khan, meaning me, does not hunt tigers. And in any case, the government has limited the hunting of tigers because there are so few left. So there is, in a sense, a very important shift in terms of the larger middle class ethic, which does require some emphasis. By the mid-1970s, as you know, the Indian polity was in crisis. October 73 is the war of Ramadan or Yom Kippur. Oil prices went up fourfold. Many of the redistributive programs which the Congress government had promised effectively went out of the window. And in 1970-75, following a period of political turmoil, India enters a 1.5-year period of the emergency. Contingency is very important in politics, but it's equally important in environmental history. And some of the early dislocations and evictions, because that's what they were, which happened from the tiger reserves, actually happened in the emergency. Ranthambore, Rajasthan, is a signal case. In 77, when Mrs. Gandhi loses the election, or for a variety of reasons, one of them being the forced sterilization campaign, which was overseen by many state governments, but under the on the instance of the federal government, the question arose, what would happen next? I find here marks of continuity, which are both reassuring and disturbing. The reassuring is that the new government did not, and it's important, discontinue Project Tiger. The Minister for Agriculture and Forests, at this time, Forests Department came under the Agriculture Ministry, was a very legendary minister, the longest serving minister in India from 1946 to 1979, with only 2 intervals. The first prominent Dalit in Indian politics at the pan-Indian level after Dr. B.R. Ambedkar in the post-independent Jagjivan Ram. He not only reassured delegates at a conference on the Tiger that Project Tiger would continue, but reaffirmed government's commitment. So there is a continuity in terms of the political leadership because the Tiger, as I emphasized, had become Indian. You are all familiar with the work of Anu Jalai on the tragedy of Morijha. And I think it is important to emphasize that in the 70s, around the time of Project Tiger, there are a number of other forms of environmental awakening that take place. It is striking, May 1973, a month after the launch of Project Tiger, when our friend was enacting this wonderful dialogue in Zanjeer on the silver screen, is the first major demonstration of what became known as the Chipko movement. And by the 1980s, it's interesting that Project Tiger's trajectory is set. There's an article written by the director of Project Tiger, who had earlier been at Kanha Park, overseen, in fact, the first relocation, displacement, eviction of villages from the area within Kanha Park, where there were Barasinga and tigers. And he wrote an article in 1983 whose title is interesting. It's called What to Do When You Have Succeeded, Project Tiger 10 Years On. And Mr. Pawar, of course, saw a continuity of the same sort of policies. The 80s and 90s, of course, turn out to be rather different. You're all aware that in the 80s and 90s, there is a hardening of opinions. This becomes evident much more in the 90s. I'm going to stop with just a quick jump to 2005, when there are 2005-6, when there are two very interesting initiatives at the union government level, which seemingly point in different directions. One was the appointment of the Tiger Task Force after large-scale killing of tigers in a tiger reserve in northwest India, Sariska, one of the original 9, for the tiger-borne trade in China. And there was a fear that poaching might wipe out the tiger. This Tiger Task Force had 5 members, and one of the interesting issues it raised was that the entire issue of relocation had been done in a manner that was not inclusive, not participative, and many of the figures that my distinguished colleagues just quoted arose from the recommendations of this Tiger Task Force. All these figures of 10 lakh and 15 lakh. The converse of this, however, was that the Tiger Task Force wanted tiger reserves put on a legal footing. There is an amendment in the Wildlife Protection Act. The tiger reserve with a capital T&R becomes a legal category. The entire tiger reserve, which earlier was divided into the core, no humans allowed, a buffer, a wildlife sanctuary with presence of settlements, presence of people, presence of cattle, but with regulation to protect wildlife interests, all of this becomes the. So in a very interesting sense, it leads to both an acknowledgement of the rights and duties of government, recognition of a space for citizens, but also of an expansion of powers. The other change, of course, is a year later, due to campaigns through the 90s, when there is a powerful wildlife lobby, which also goes to courts and wants very strict enforcement and removal of all people resident within forests. In 2006, there is a Forest Rights Act, which for all its limitations, they emerged so very well in the previous paper, for the first time acknowledges that those who live within forests have rights. I think this is very, very important, because the Forest Rights Act 1878, which is the key act, the later amendments are minor, actually provides for reserved forests where rights are recorded and settled. So those who reside within reserved forests may have privileges. They don't have rights. They certainly don't have rights of settlement. And the Forest Rights Act for the first time laid down procedures for scheduled tribes, for other traditional forest dwellers, by which these rights could be codified and identified. It's important to note, these figures, of course, need to be verified, that over 3 million families have got land rights for 1 to 2 acres of land across the various states. The Forest Rights Act also provided for community rights. And here it's important to note that the record is certainly not anywhere near the 3 million forest rights that have been done. Where then are we in terms of the tiger becoming Indian? It seems to me that a lot of conservation or preservation in many countries is about nationalism. The environmental movement is about one earth. It's about the equality of different species, the equality of the present generation with the future. But the reality of the world is it is broken nation states. These are unequal both between each other and within. And in dealing with one kind of inequality, humans and other species, the present and future generations, how does one deal with other forms of inequality? And needless to add that the project of the nation is a continuing, dynamic, and I was very struck by the previous speaker who used very important words. He used the words multiple meanings, contested meanings, contradictions, overlaps. This applies not only to animality, but to humanity. And I think it's significant that in this 50-year period, we see a range of transformations, but there are two that endure. One is there seems to be a large political consensus across the spectrum, not just about the tiger, but other life forms. Nobody publicly wants to call for their extinction or extermination. I think it's a very major change. Having said that, how one coexists with them in a country where there are 400 people to a square kilometer, 1 billion more than when Project Tiger was launched, but also an economy which is expanding at a much greater rate. It's the fastest growing economy on earth, whether you take official figures bang on or not, since 1980, it's one of the fastest growing economies. And one of the emergent conflicts, of course, is that while the Wildlife Protection Act, Forest Conservation Act, all of these were formulated largely about the regulation of biomass and land. We are in an economy where much of the wealth is in fossil fuels and minerals which are beneath the surface. And it's no coincidence that these are what provokes deep conflict today. So I'll just end with this, that the history cannot predict the future, but it can give us a sense of why these contests are so intense, and that there are multiple meanings of what one means by what is right and what is just and what is effective. And the terrain for these has shifted. And one of the significant points is the broad unity continues with continuing contest. But that is what democracy is about. Democracies are very good at liberty, but are they as good at equality? And how can they address the question of equality? Project Tiger and its attendant issues, the conservation, the critiques, exemplify this in very specific ways. Thank you.
Thanks, Mahesh, for that thought-provoking paper and for bringing to life some of the people and the politics and the thinking that went into the making of the Indian tiger. Before we have the Q&A, I invite Raza Kasmi to respond to both the papers.
Thank you so much to Professor Rangarajan, Akshay, Pranav, and Amir for such wonderful presentation. It's a very hard task to follow Professor Rangarajan once he's given one of his presentations. But I'll try my best. I think I'll go first with the paper that was presented by Pranav, Akshay, and Amir. It was a fantastic paper, and it is very important that often when we have such conferences, it is rare that you get a voice from the ground, from within the communities who are affected in whichever ways due to conservation and tiger conservation or wildlife conservation in general. So it was great to have a perspective from somebody who is residing in those forests and lives in that community and is active about the rights of their people. I think my experience with One Gujars have been very limited. I have a few interactions. I think a lot of the issues were laid out very well by all the three speakers there. But I think one of the questions that I had in mind was, and this is something that I had, because I had encountered this, was so my interactions with One Gujars were in the eastern part of Kumaon, in a place called Nandhor, which is east of Haldwani. And Rajaji and these lie in western part of the Kumaon. And a lot of time when I was talking to the community members, there seemed to be some disagreements on how to go about with, dealing with the issues that come with the forest department within the community, between, say, the Gujars of Eastern Kumaon compared to the One Gujars of Western Kumaon. So I wanted to understand if there are, from the speakers, if there are within the larger One Gujar community, there are issues regarding, what the future course of action should be, in terms of management of these forests, and what the role of the community should be in these forests. Are there people who are actually willing to go out? Are there people who are much more opposed to go out these forests or be resettled? So I wanted to understand that perspective. And I think with Professor Rangarajan, he's pretty much covered all the ground that one could in those opening decades. I think one of the things that really Professor Rangarajan brought out very well was that how the tiger in these initial late 60s, 70s becomes a mascot of conservation or of nationalism, not just within the confines of people who are interested in wildlife and are working in that sector, but also with the larger cultural milieu of the country. So, for example, in films, and Ranveer is one example, but if you go through a list of Bollywood cinema, you will find that throughout the 70s, there is a string of Bollywood movies which have wildlife and tiger conservation as its theme. So there is a particular form of nationalism that is going out into the public through that. There is, for the first time, wildlife becomes a very important issue, and especially tigers become a very important talking point in the various weeklies that are being published in the 1970s. Illustrated Weekly of India, that used to carry articles on tiger conservation every month almost. And similarly with the newspapers, with various regional newspapers. So what is happening is that especially the urban English-speaking middle class, is being exposed to this ethic of tiger conservation. And a lot of the officialdom or the bureaucracy that would come further down the road comes from a generation which has grown up reading about these issues and being shaped by a certain worldview which was permeated by or provided by the authors of those articles, who actually came from a much more older school of conservation. Where, as it used to be, the role of communities and how the contradictions with conservation and community are issues which were not really deliberated upon back in those days. So a very sort of, one could argue that a very uh, one-sided or dominated by one side, that sort of view of tiger conservation and what it entails came through this period of 70s and 80s across various forms of popular media. Similarly, so that is something that Professor Rangarajan brought out really well. And I think I would just, one of the questions that I had for Professor Rangarajan was, he briefly touched upon the fact that tiger conservation movement, sort of, so to speak, from within the bureaucracy and from the political class and from naturalists, comes around in the early 70s and picks up throughout the decade of the 70s. And at the same time, there is a movement of for the Chipko movement in Uttarakhand. So, were there any overlaps in sort of these two movements? And if there were or they weren't, so why was it so? And also because this is also the time where other movements towards forest conservation, led from by the communities, are beginning. But there doesn't seem to have been a convergence between these two streams, which one would assume have the same end goal in mind of conservation and preservation of fauna and flora of that particular landscape. And this is something that we have seen continue even into the present, where when we speak of environmentalism, it is always clubbed into two quote unquote camps, that there are these quote unquote wildlife wallahs who only care about wildlife and interested in tigers, and there are these activist people wallahs who are only concerned about people. And at the end of it, they are working in the same geographical and physical landscape. And yet there seems to be a break between these two streams. And I wanted to understand what might be the historical, causes behind this, since they both emerged significantly around the same time period of the 1970s. I think these would be the two questions that I would pose to the speakers, and let them have a go.
Thanks, Raza, for those comments. I don't know, anybody could go first. Would Akshay like to go first?
Yeah, sure. So, Raza, regarding the Nandor area, I mean, and your question on what's the future course of action, what are the role of communities, whether they are willing to stay inside the forest. I think it's also linked to the larger issue of like what we've been talking about, the imposition of rights or restrictions within these forest areas also. So we've seen that there is a constant pressure, like due to the heavy regime of tiger conservation itself. There is huge pressure not just on tiger reserves but the neighboring areas as well. So if you look at Nandar, it's been discussed in the NTC, National Tiger Conservation Authority meetings as well, to declare that area as a tiger reserve as well. So because it forms like a kind of a corridor. I mean, our first of all, our interpretation of a corridor in terms of tiger conservation is also vague. It's very arbitrary, and there's nothing on the policy level as well. So there is a fear within the community that at a certain point in time they are going to be moved out. So that is the, and again, in addition to that, also there's also a lot of developmental activities which have been happening around that area as well, which also impacts their decisions on whether they want to stay or not. For example, like Nandor mein, the Khatima area is the constituency of the current chief minister of Uttarakhand, Pushkar Singh Dhami. So he had a proposal just very recently to declare that area as an ecotourism zone for crocodiles. Having the entire area declared as a tourism zone, and then have crocodile trails. The direct implication of have just getting that proposal out was that the Fanguja families living in that area are to be removed. So that question, that threat, everyday threat in terms the threat in terms of the larger implications, and in terms of the day-to-day interaction with the forest department is there, which I think which kind of makes a major decision in terms of the impact it has on the decision-making abilities of the community. In addition, I think maybe Pranav or Hamza bhai can also share on that aspect of it. Sorry, Pranav is saying that since he logged out, he's not able to unmute. If you...
So I want to, if I may, Raza, that's a very important point. There's a point of commonality between the critics of the dominant model. I'll just stay with forestry. It's a little easier for me then. This critique on production forestry and emphasis on what one may call ecological integrity is common to those who are interested in preservation. Remember, at this time, it's largely faunal preservation, though flora comes in, and the critics of the system from below. But where they see stability is very different. Preservation for those who are advocating it in the 70s and 80s hinges on what one may call statism, seeing government and action from above as vital because there's crisis, it requires central direction, may require enforcement, it requires executive action. And it's not a coincidence they evoke Ashoka. I'm not saying it because I'm from university named after Ashoka, but Ashoka as a imperial symbol. They see Ashoka and the Ashokan edicts, which, as you know, talk about different animals which shouldn't be hunted. They, in fact, refer to the rhinoceros and possibly a water creature, maybe the Gangetic dolphin. And this notion of the centralized state as a centralizing state, it's not centralized state, it's very important, it's a federal system as the stabilizer. But Chipko and Jharkhand, just to give two instances, their ideas are deeply local ideas. Their ideas for moral economy, for political community, non-violent democratic action. The newly translated remarkable autobiography of Chandra Prasad Bhatt, the Hindi title actually was Gudgudi. I don't know how you translate Gudgudi, being tickled. And the English one is called Gentle Resistance. It's a deeply inspiring story. I mean, it's such an inspiring story because he says in the 50s and 60s, when he worked in the Bhudan movement and went into rural areas, he began to realize how destructive the extraction of the forest was to people. And their approach is for decentralized exploitation of the forest, which then takes up protection of the forest. Similarly, the protests against teak plantation, which has very little relevance for livelihood or cultures of Jharkhand. There are overlaps. So in 79, when there are bustard hunts, the Bishnois in Rajasthan work with the urban preservationists against it. In Kerala, the Sastra Sahitya Parishad, which is broadly left of center, popular science movement, combines forces with Indira Gandhi against the Silent Valley project. So unlike forces can combine when there is an external adversary, but they fundamentally differ on whether the forest, just to go back, is an ecological entity excluding humans, barring scientists and managers, or is it a biophysical entity inclusive of humans who can understand its rhythms and try to reconcile their quest for dignity and livelihood with the continued existence of the forest as an entity. There is a fundamental divide, and I think democracy is it's for the survival of the tiger, but who's its best friend is a deeply contested idea then as now.
If I could answer some of what Raza's query was around the difference between how notions attached to conservation are in Kumaon and Garhwal. So in the Kumaon region, most of the Van Gujar pastoralists today find themselves sedentarized, and there is a shift towards agro-pastoral livelihood. Whereas in the Garhwal region, I feel there is still around 40 to 45% families engage in seasonal migration regularly. And in that regard, again, this is where certain facets of the tiger conservation project particularly comes in conflict because of how uh, forest conservation then or the gaze which is attached to wildlife tourism becomes rooted in fulfilling a certain kind of ethic which tourists want, and then some of the ethnographic snippets which I had from forest officials in this region was also like, for the park to run, we need tourists to come. So the part which I was about to conclude with was around Kunau Chord, the area where Hamza lives, and how it is a grassland space, but at the same time you have afforestation policies acting as regimes of dispossession here, as well as notions of how a dominant caste elite in the neighboring village can mobilize themselves to declare that village as a revenue zone rather than a revenue area rather than a forest area. So by enabling that kind of classification, then these particular people engage more in tourist practices, whereas pastoral communities like the Van Gujars don't necessarily find themselves worthy enough or civilized enough to engage in that work. So pastoral work somewhere then seems to be rooted in those ideas of backwardness, whereas and therefore land mobility also, then the possibility of them using the land for tourism purposes can never exist. Whereas for the upper caste elite, the party elite, this kind of ways that the tiger protection aligns with their way of claiming more land. So there is that politics also which you can see around the Gadwal region per se. So I think Akshay explained that conflict around the crocodile park, but some of these facets of how there's this constant shift towards agro-pastoralism, which Van Gujars are somewhat forced to engage with when resettlement processes are pushed on them. But if those for those pastoralists who continue to not settle, they are somewhat seen as iterant. So various modes of criminalization gets reactivated. So I hope there's some sort of connection. Thanks.
Thanks, Pranav. Now we're open for questions. Please raise your hand or post them in the chat box. I just had a quick question for Professor Mahesh Rangarajan. I'm a PhD student at IIT Delhi, and I was just thinking about how you talked about this political consensus that is built for Project Tiger, and just a few days back in Wayanad, a tiger killed a man, and the political and the legal machinery are asking for the tiger to be killed. So I just want to know what it is that distinguishes the political and the historical consensus that the Project Tiger has, as opposed to localized protests and hostility towards tigers. Thanks.
So I think that's such a good illustration where there are tigers or leopards or elephants or bears or wolves, which are a threat to human life. There is a outcry, understandably, even justifiably, that action be taken, that it be trapped or eliminated. But note what we are saying. It's very significant. That particular tiger has to be identified, captured, eliminated. See, up to the 1920s, there was a reward bounty given for any tiger and tigress anywhere in the British India. Some 1,1600 were being killed. This practice ends. But it continues in many states. So in West Bengal, up to 1972, any Sundarban tiger that you killed, you were given a reward. This is very significant. We are identifying that there are individual tigers, which are already seen as aberrant tigers. This is even among the people who want to catch it. So this idea that tigers, in Hindi, there is very nice term, prajati, the species, as opposed to the individual. So this is what I'm not saying there's a Project Tiger. There is no public outcry that tigers or elephants be eliminated. This is very significant. This is a historically specific moment we are living over the last 50, 60, 70 years. I would say this is after 1970 largely that has come about. When there are these large animals, and this is the real challenge, actually the landscape is a continuum. Neither the tiger nor the elephant knows where the reserve ends. Their habitats include areas beyond the reserve. And we are also aware that, contraintuitive to what we think, some of these species, populations, not species, are expanding their habitats. There are, 20 odd tigers in the greater Bhopal region, of whom 9 to 10 are adults. How does one live with them? Interestingly, they've not harmed human beings at all. There are camera traps. And there is a series of ways in which forest department, revenue officials, civil officials, and citizens there of different classes, communities are working together. There's no outcry there to kill off the tigers. As long as it doesn't harm you, you let it live. This is very significant. And I would argue this is probably a longer historical experience without uh, romanticizing. There can be areas of extremely sharp conflict. Pilibhit is one, very sharp conflict. Tadoba is another. And there's very important film, unusually, sorry, I go to cinema, but I rarely find a film so sensitively made with a woman forest officer played by Vidya Balan called Sherni. And I am astounded by the film because it shows the multiple pressures she's trying to handle. And it actually is rather critical of the government at the end. It's extremely critical. And what I'm struck by in that film is that people are particularly worried about a particular tiger, and there is a notion that certain tigers are aberrant. I'm not saying whether this is right or wrong, that I leave to parties. So there's no consensus, and Project Tiger has broad popular endorsement as a good thing. Now, how the good thing should be carried out in democracy, those are very contested. This question on the agrarian committees. No, I'm not speaking of the agrarian communities. I'm speaking of the policy communities. I'm speaking of the political, bureaucratic, that leadership. And it's not such a strange thing. After all, in 1970, 71, 75% of the labor force in India was dependent on agriculture. Today, it's about 42, 45%. Secondly, at that time, the percentage of the GDP from agriculture was larger. The area which was under permanent irrigation was small. Tube well irrigation, which is what stabilized cultivation in large areas, it did and has depleted the groundwater, was still in early stage of expansion. But it's more about a sense of legitimation. And there, I would argue that perhaps there is a larger legitimation which goes beyond a narrow political leadership. We must be very careful when we say political leadership. After all, the members of legislative assemblies, as well as the Lok Sabha, are elected. After 1993-94, there are also urban and rural local bodies. If you add all of that, that's 3 million elected representatives. And they all live in mortal fear of losing the next election. Any elected representative does. They're scared they lose. And there, if one sees this idea that the forest is important to bring rainfall, that it keeps stability of the water cycle, is very widespread. Now, I am not suggesting it's scientifically 100% valid, but this is a widely held view that the forest is important not for itself, but for us. And here is the paradox. This is the desiccation hypothesis of surgeons, botanists, and various Brits working for the East India Company in 1830s. An idea is articulated by someone, it comes back in a totally roundabout way and has a very different meaning. And of course, this has been invoked by those who want very strict wildlife protection with draconian laws also. But it's equally invoked by people who want what they say is as democratic control. So this hydraulic cycle issue is very crucial, not only in India, but I would argue across monsoon Asia, the 20-odd monsoon-dependent Asian societies, the issue of forest conservation is often seen, or wildlife conservation is seen as important for larger stability. Today, we would call it climatic stability. Well, that's an early version of the climatic stability notion, the hydraulic cycle, wet and dry spells, and what do you do in places with sharply defined wet and dry spells? And it seems logical in this manner of thinking to protect the green cover.
Yes, we have another question in the chat that the speakers are welcome to respond to. But in the meantime, Anu, go ahead.
Professor Rangarajan, because you were just speaking about, the individual tiger versus the prajati, and how certain tigers become or are seen as aberrant because they start killing people. I was just thinking about, the tiger Avni who was killed, I think, a couple of years ago.
Yes.
And I got to read plenty about
Yes.
it also because the person who shot her down is I don't know what to call him, a professional hunter in the 21st
Yes.
century sounds like
Yes.
it's hard to get out of
Yes.
one's mouth, but that's how he was referred to. And there was a really big backlash against the incident,
Yeah.
not just here in Hyderabad, but elsewhere in the country as well. And at the same time, in Ranthambore, I believe there was also a tiger that was suspected of having killed people, in the sense that there were people being killed, and a particular tiger was being blamed as being the one, but that the evidence was not foolproof. One was not 100% sure if that was the one or not. I wonder if you would share with us your thoughts about the whole Avni incident first. Yes, Ustad, that's the one. Thank you.
Yes. Yes. See, there is very interesting, both in Avni, where this person from minor title nobility of Hyderabad, very charming gentleman if you meet him, his views are the exact opposite. At least that's my view. It's very significant. This is a well-known case, Avni, where he writes this book. It's doing very well. It's called The Hunt for India's Most Dangerous Man-Eater. And you're right, it could have been written in the 1860s or 1930s. And this has counterparts. In Uttarakhand, since we're talking about it, there have been leopards shot, and the person who shoots it is then paraded around as a great hero. Firstly, it's not that easy to identify which individual leopard or tiger is. We should be clear about this. Second, there's a parallel which is actually, to me, even more disturbing. Many states in India have declared certain animals vermin. Now, vermin is a typical imperial colonial category. So there's no one answer to this. And perhaps there ought to be much more careful study of what drives the behavior of animals. The one thing we know, and we should be, in the last 50 years, there's a lot of both scholarly work on lions, particularly on their behavior, less so on tigers. There's a lot of anecdotal scholarship on tigers. Individual lions and tigers behave differently in even the same given situation. Tigers in a particular landscape behave differently from tigers in another. So the Sundarbans tigers we've been learning about are rather different from those in Rajaji, etc. So this has to be very case specific. And the Ranthambore case and Avni are both interesting because there were those who celebrated the capture or killing of the tiger. But there is the other notion that every tiger has as much right as every human. And this is also problematic given a society where the exposure of risk is vastly different depending on the social, political, social, cultural, class, caste status of the person. So again, we are back to this question. I mean, there is no one way. And whichever way we deal with it, it reproduces in many ways the fractures and frissions in society. But I would be more positive. The fact that there is recognition that there may be particular drivers of behavior is significant. What are they? How can they be identified? Are they structural? Are they contingent? What can one, whichever way we look at it, it will require a much more cooperative model. And these are very fractious situations. There are situations where members of, people have been very critical of NGOs, but there are wildlife NGOs which have helped tranquilize a tiger in very difficult circumstances, a so-called man-eater or alleged man-eater, and move it out. And all the evidence points to a particular tiger in Pilibhit, certainly, who killed and ate several people in succession. It had sort of become a specialist in hunting people. So there's a larger issue driving this, and it's tricky. If you have 50, 60 years of no hunting, the animal's behavior changes. It becomes more trusting. But does it, given it's a carnivore, begin hunting people, not just animals? I'm being very specific. Now, if that happens, particularly the last, it's very serious. Even the former, given the significance of cattle and livestock in economies and cultures, how is that to be dealt with? These are very significant issues. I don't have an answer, but one should share the sense of disquiet of celebration. It's disturbing.
Professor Alika, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for both the papers. Both were very excellent. I'm really interested in the paper that was co-presented and co-authored by 3 scholars. I'm particularly interested in that because I think it's a very rare paper to bring in the voices from the ground. The views by Hamza Bhai was very, very powerful for me because we look at Project Tiger as a very top-down approach. But here we see a new form of knowledge production here, which is collaborative, bringing in views from multiple perspectives. And I want to know, how would Project Tiger look like if we bring in more voices from the ground? And I feel one of the critics of Project Tiger is also that it is very, very, very bureaucratic applied, through heavy bureaucracy, and we don't see views from the ground. So my question to maybe both Mahesh, who's a historian, who can give us a picture of how would Project Tiger look like if there are more presentation by other people who are from the community, like Hamza Bhai's. And this is a question I think I'm just more curious to find out, to think about. This is a new form of knowledge production. The challenges that comes, it's not easy to write a paper together with the communities, and so I find what we are doing here is giving space to people who can tell us what is happening on the ground, in the name of Project Tiger. And how will Project Tiger look like if there are more voices from people like Hamza Bhai? So this is like an open question. I'm curious to know. Thank you.
I'll just translate the question for Hamza Bhai, and then he would want to answer this, if that's okay. तो हमजा भाई ये पूछ रहे हैं कि जो प्रोजेक्ट टाइगर की परिभाषा है, अगर वनवासी अगर उसकी ओर बात करना चाहेंगे तो वो कैसे हो सकता है आपके हिसाब से?
मैं ये कह रहा था कि बहुत अच्छा क्वेश्चन है, और अक्सर अगर ये देखा जाए हमारी जो फॉरेस्ट डेवलपर्स की दृष्टि में जो टाइगर प्रोजेक्ट होना चाहिए वो उनकी जो लोक कथाएं हैं, लोक भाषाएं हैं, उनकी दैनिक उपयोग में जो उनका जैसे हमारे यहाँ टाइगर्स ज्यादातर हमारे कैटल्स को खाता है, लेकिन रिलीजन्स में हम लोग उसको शुभ मानते हैं कि हमारे पूरे ग्रुप में से अगर किसी भैंस को अगर टाइगर ने खाया है तो वो हमारे लिए शुभ है, और उसको हम लोग कभी भी गाली नहीं देते। तो ये मेथड है फॉरेस्ट डेवलपर्स का टाइगर्स को लेकर। इनकी जो मैंने पहले पीपीटी में बताया कि किस तरीके से वनगुज्जर समुदाय द्वारा खुद ही जो टाइगर प्रोजेक्ट को लेकर जो उसका पूरा हैबिटेट एरिया, क्रिटिकल एरिया, जो अलग अलग तरीके से उनकी दैनिक उपयोग के रूप में विभाजित किया हुआ, बनाया हुआ है, उसी के आधार पर हम लोग प्रोजेक्ट टाइगर को देखेंगे। जो समुदाय, क्योंकि वो प्रोजेक्ट टाइगर एक हो सकता है साइंटिफिक नाम हो या टेक्निकल नाम हो, लेकिन वनगुजर की भाषा में जो बृहस्पतिवार वीकली का जो एक पार्ट है, जंगल को विभाजित करके टाइगर प्रोजेक्ट बनाने की बात, तो वो उनका जो ट्रेडिशनल मेथड, उसके हिसाब से हम टाइगर प्रोजेक्ट को देखना चाहते हैं, ताकि हमारा टाइगर भी स्वस्थ रहे, हमारे जंगल भी स्वस्थ रहे, और हमारी जो पहचान है टाइगर प्रोजेक्ट की वो वनगुजर समुदाय के साथ भी जुड़ी हो, हम ये मानते हैं और ये चाहते हैं।
So, if I can summarize Hamza's words in a simpler language, like rather than this entire idea of looking at wildlife through a project-driven, if it's understood more as a process-driven conservation. So when I say process-driven, Mahesh sir mentioned the importance of the FRA, but at the same time, when we also want to speak about the tiger as an autonomous subject, there when we speak of non-human governance, and there is a kind of anthropomorphism which automatically creeps in when we want to attribute agency to non-human tigers. But then such anthropomorphism would be better if forest dwellers can communicate that anthropomorphism than us as like someone who does not engage on an everyday basis of seeing a tiger in front of us. So I believe in how we understand human non-human governance, the experiences of one Gujars in that landscape, and how they realize the tiger to be as an autonomous subject in itself. So the fact that when Hamza mentioned that they do practice a particular the weekly movement of the tiger is understood, that oh, on this particular day the tiger is supposed to be in this area. So it's not, when we look at questions of conflict or coexistence, it need not be only seen as just a scenario of this or that, but it can also be a scenario of coexistence if there is a kind of way that the privacy of the tiger is kept aloof. At the same time, the livelihood of the pastoralists or the forest dwellers are not impacted. So how they negotiate that space, it need not always be seen as contestation. It can also be seen as a form of coexistence. So I hope some of what Hamza said I could translate.
See, I think it's an excellent question, Dr. Ayaduran. Let me frame this in a larger way. See, Project Tiger is not in isolation. There's a book, ये हिंदी में कहूँ तो ज़्यादा सही होगा, but most people here are not Hindi speakers, and By the way, Tamil is my mother tongue, so I will not do that. See, there is a book called Search for Equality in Land of Hierarchy. How do you find equality in land of hierarchy or society of hierarchy? It's on India, it could be on other societies. And in this, we have to be clear what we are dealing. Largely, we are dealing with Forest Department. Forest Department has very different structure and history from, let us say, Revenue or Agriculture Department. Forest Department foundation in first 20 years is staffed by military officers. If you look at their names, they are Colonel, Captain, Major. Why? Because they wore the uniform. Why did they wear uniform? Because forest was seen as a frontier zone where they're imposing orders. Very important. And in the forest space, the Forest Department takes over the land and the productive process. Unusual. Because if you look at agriculture, I'm not saying Revenue Civil Department were very kind to the peasants. I'm not saying that. But the production process is not controlled, right? Not directly, at least. So with the Forest Department, this point you're making about land annexation and others, it's very significant given its history. So it's not only about democratizing the Forest Department, it's also transforming your idea of the forest and the power structure. That's one. Related to this, the FRA only opens a door. It's not a cure-all. There is an idea that there are rights. Earlier, there were no rights. See, one of the most fascinating changes in independent India is in last 70 years, 75 years, that big zamindar rent receiver has disappeared. The large landed estates have got broken. Many communities which had no land rights and tenant farmers, marginal people, have got some land. They may not have got equality, but they have land they stand on. It's very difficult to convey, particularly in societies where owning some property gives you some assurance. This did not happen with the forest peoples and groups. They did not have that right. That has only come about through the Forest Rights Act, and we're in very early stages of realization. So how do these forest-reliant peoples, who are anyway in any hierarchy, whether you look at, economic power, education, share of wealth, etc., they are among the most underprivileged groups. This applies to scheduled tribes, to Dalits, to OBCs, but it may even apply to groups who are so-called forward communities, such as in parts of Garhwal Kumaon. How do they become equal citizens and partners? Project Tiger is a microcosm of that larger project, but it shows up in stark light because of the nature of the Forest Department's history. And yes, this idea that state power alone will save the tiger, at least on the face of it, they also accept that's not working. I think it's very significant. Even in the last 25 years, government on the face of it does say it wants partnership, may not be doing it very well. There are places where it's not doing it at all, places where it's doing it reasonably well, and there are places where it needs to begin doing. So I think it's a very important question. How would Project Tiger look if one were to bring these imaginations? It would look very different, but it may look different in different places. It will look different to different people in each place. So this democratizing of the forest through engagement with the existing processes of democracy, which I would in fact argue there are very important processes which are not being activated. Governmental processes, legislative processes. The bureaucracy in India predates the coming of parliamentary and legislative democracy. Bureaucracy, look at the term used, collector, divisional forest officer. You'll often, the notion of collector is someone who collects revenue. Divisional forest officer will often say it's my forest. It's very interesting. How can someone say it's my forest? You're posted there for 3 years. I'm not saying it's unnecessarily negative. That has to change. So it's a very, very good question. This requires a full seminar and lot of work. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. With that, we come to the end of this session. Thank you for all your active participation today. It's been very productive, and I appreciate the insights and contributions of all our speakers. We will continue this conversation at 7:30 in the last panel of this symposium called Contested Futures. I hope to see some of you there. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you. धन्यवाद आप सबका.
Dhanyavad.
Thank you so much. Thank you.